Subsidy removal and foreign exchange unification have been picked out as major reforms that turned the tide around for the economy. And that's according to Sam Chidoka, the managing director at Anchoria Capital Group. He notes that pushing on the winds will achieve accelerated growth for the country. Take a listen.
Well, if you look at it, what we've seen is some of the big wins for me. I would say one of the major big wins for me would be the fact that subsidy removal has allowed us to have more revenue for state governments and local governments and the federal government itself. Also, if you look at the fact that one of the wins that I would talk about as well is what I would call FX unification, in the sense that in time past, we used to have maybe 4 or 5 different exchange rates. Today, we have one basic exchange rate, and it's been more or less predictable, allowing people who do business with FX to plan. Another thing I would say that is a win for the government will be how inflation has been dealt with. Inflation has tended lower, MPR has remained at 26.5, and then over time we have seen a situation where one can also plan, and inflation has moderated and is basically under control. The last thing that I'd like to talk about is also the way that we've seen the government deal with issues around how they manage the budget, and in terms of our debt service ratios. So when you look at our debt service to revenue, it's been tending downwards. There was a time in this country where our debt service to revenue was over 100%. Today, from the records that we see, maybe it's somewhere around 45% today. And I'll say kudos to the government in line with all of those.
Yes. And let's also spotlight now the CBN governor, Olayemi Kadoso, also marking 3 years in office. Talking about the trajectory we've seen so far, you've highlighted the disinflation trend and then FX stability. But what structural change remains largely unfinished for you?
Yeah, so if you look at the economy from a standpoint of where we're coming from, what both the monetary policy and the fiscal policies of the government has allowed us to do, especially the monetary policy side, is that we have stability. So we've created a system that we have economic stability, we have predictability, we have, you can plan using these economy indices because there's been some stability. However, now that we have stability, the next thing we want to see is accelerated growth. We want to see the macroeconomic wins begin to trickle down to individuals and to families. How do you begin to deal with issues around poverty? From the records, we still have over 100 million Nigerians with multidimensional poverty. You need to deal with that. We still have issues around the fact that there is no release in terms of budgetary releases. When the budget has been made, the cash backing it up sometimes does not come as it should do. And so we need to see a change in that. So there needs to be that trickle-down effect where you've had wins on the macro level. We now need to begin to see those wins in terms of reducing poverty, in terms of increasing the spending ability of Nigerians and increasing the earning ability of Nigerians, and of course, increasing the growth of the GDP. We should be growing anywhere over 6% for us to meet the $1 trillion planned economy.
Yes. And moving further, as we focus on things much more from an investor's point of view now, let's talk about some of the highlights we've seen within our equities market and also look at the fixed income market. Looking at the earnings growth, the sort of current valuations we have here, and how investors are still pricing in an economic recovery that is yet to fully materialize. What are the catalysts we need now to trigger the next big flows of FPIs and FDIs? And how do you think investors are digesting all of this information ahead of next year's elections?
Yeah, so, well, you took it right from me. I was going to say that we have to be careful now because we're in election period. And usually what happens is that there's a scare around elections. However, if I may, I think that for any foreign investor who's looking to Nigeria from outside in, you will realize that we've had very many series of elections from 1999 all the way to 2027. And typical with Nigeria, those elections have been successful. A successor has come into office, handover has happened. So I think that the risk premium with elections and Nigeria should begin to reduce, because you've seen us do it over and over again. However, on the government side, I think there has to be policy stability. Policy stability is important for anybody looking from outside in. So I'll give you a typical example. We did T+2 in terms of the equities market. Then we did T+1, and immediately it triggered the foreign market when people thought they had to pre-fund before they could participate in the equity market. But when they had engagements with the SEC, engagement with the regulators, NGX, and Ministry of Finance, it was clear that you don't have to pre-fund to invest in our equities market. And once that was cleared out, some form of confidence returned. So there needs to be policy consistency for people who are outside to continue to invest in our economy. And then I would say also that the economic wins that we've had, we don't need reversals. We need to continue to push on those wins. There's stability. We now need to accelerate growth. We need to make sure that individuals and families are getting the benefit of the things that government decisions that we had in recent past. Remember, subsidy removal meant that government made more money, but it also meant that households spent more money. And so we need to catalyze the economy in such a way that households will begin to earn more disposable income, spend that, grow the economy, and we're all better for it.
Yes. I like the fact that you touched on the need for policy continuity, because at the end of the day, that's also one of the risks investors are looking out for. But let's talk about the expectation around GDP numbers. We are having different houses peg at about a 4% GDP growth rate, but that's not enough because the population is growing much faster. What would it take now for us to be able to achieve this $1 trillion economy, either under this Tinubu administration or any new administration that wins the elections come next year?
Look, you'd have to, like I said, you have to be growing at upwards of 6 or 7% year on year to scratch anywhere near a $1 trillion economy. At 4% is good because it's better than where we're coming from, but it's not the number that would take us to a $1 trillion economy. It's not the number. That number is anywhere perhaps between 7% and 10% GDP growth year on year. So we have to find ways to catalyze the economy. We have to find ways to make sure that goods and services are produced in larger volumes and trade happens in larger volumes, for us to be able to catalyze the economy and grow and achieve that sort of number that we're seeing. And one of the ways that we can do this is to make sure that government on its own side continue to monitor and regulate businesses, that government continues to make sure that there is sanctity of contracts. If people sign contracts, we should ensure that they can keep to those contracts. What that means is that it will embolden people to do business. If you're in a country where you sign a contract and it's not what the paper is written on, it reduces the efficacy of business transactions, which ultimately reduces what you make in terms of GDP growth. So I think there needs to be further judicial reforms that make sure that we have judges and courts that can take on cases and finish them quickly so that adjudication in terms of contracts can happen quickly. Government on this part needs to release funds to the different departments and ministries to make sure that they are catalyzing the economy. Government needs to invest heavily in infrastructure. Most times when there are elections try this distance government from implementation. But I think this government should take a different cue. Continue with policy implementation, continue with infrastructure development, continue government spending, which has a catalytic effect, which has a domino effect that continues to spur the economy. And of course, encourage the private sector. Tax reforms are good, but we need to press it down further. Multiple taxes must be out of our economy. People must be able to pay taxes that they ought to pay and not what the tax authority think is right.
Yes, and Mr. Chidoka, wrapping up the conversation, if we were to produce another reforms card come next year, which numbers do you expect to look significantly better, or which would you say would still remain a cause for concern for you?
So if we're now, like I said, we have stability. What we want to see is growth. How do you cause growth to happen? Inflation needs to come down furthermore. I would like to see the inflation figures come down, not because of rebasing of inflation, but because we've actually taken definite steps to reduce inflation. So I like to see inflation numbers come down. I like to see poverty numbers come down. I like to see also exchange rates begin to trickle down to the point where you find an equilibrium price that allows exports, but also allows us to do imports as a country. All right? So those are the kind of things that...
Concerns around debt?
Sorry, say that again.
Concerns around debt. What sort of numbers do you expect?
Oh, so you see, I'm not one of those who worry too much about debt, to be honest. I'm not too worried about debt. My worry is, what do you do with the funds when you get it? If our debt service to revenue is actually 45% thereabouts, then we still have room to borrow. But the question is, what do you do with the money that you have borrowed? For me, that's the major worry. I'm not one of those who just says, oh, government is borrowing, and so everybody starts screaming. Because borrowing itself is not bad, but it is what you do with it. So when government borrows and they use it to build critical infrastructure, use it to provide education, use it to provide power, use it to make sure that businesses can run in Nigeria, then the economy will grow. And so it's not so much about debt, but actually about what you do